Thank you everyone for joining. We have Delynn Southern with the Colorado Energy Office and Leslie LaRock from McKinstry to help us present on the Energy Services Coalition Stimulus Funding webinar. So we're going to keep the presentation content to under 45 minutes, and then we'll leave the remainder of Q&A. With that being said, please feel free to type questions in the chat as we go through this, and we'll either address them throughout the webinar or leave them for the end. We will be recording this, so we'll send a copy out to everyone who registered afterwards. So with that, Leslie's going to kick us off on the federal stimulus funding, so I'll hand it over to her.
Great, thanks, Ashley. Let me share my screen. Put it in slide view. Okay, great. Welcome, everyone. I'm going to be talking today about the federal stimulus funding that is available, primarily what's available in the marketplace right now, giving you kind of an overview of the landscape of the funding that has been released since early in 2020 and all the way through 2021. I'll touch a little bit on the infrastructure plan that was just recently passed, but then I'm going to pass it off to Delynn, who's going to talk more details about that future funding, how it's coming through state, and some opportunities for grants. So I'll start out with just kind of the context. So, why does the federal government step in during times of kind of emergency relief? And I think we all have been experiencing over the last couple of years the effects of the coronavirus pandemic. The government does try to step in because the federal government can run on a deficit and state governments have to be running on a balanced budget. They do step in to provide relief from time to time. There was a pretty significant loss of tax revenues early on, or at least projected to be pretty significant. I think many of the states have recovered fairly well, which is great news, but that was part of the reason back in 2020. The pandemic, changed the tax landscape, but it also really impacted the learning environment for students, both in K-12 and in higher education. And so that was another reason why the Fed stepped in, was, try to get kids back in school. And then the 1950s was really the last significant infrastructure spending bill. And, we're going to talk more about how the infrastructure bill has been skinnied down quite a bit, but I think, originally it was intended to be much larger and provide a lot of funding for local governments on improving our infrastructure. So the overall landscape of the funding, I'm going to talk a little bit about the legislation timeline. So the very first act that was passed was the CARES Act back in 2020. Then we had the Consolidated Appropriations Act, then the American Rescue Plan, and the Infrastructure Investment Act. So just kind of talking through the timeline. The CARES Act was passed back in March of 2020. It was $2.2 trillion, was intended to do a lot of emergency relief, right? So there were cash payments that went to individuals. There were cash payments, we had the federal refund that we all got, or that many people got. We had education relief and relief for state and local governments, lots of just kind of relief funding to get governments back up and running, to get the schools to be able to provide online education to students, and that was done right at the beginning. The Consolidated Appropriations Act, which was passed at the end of 2020, provided $900 billion of more money for supplemental unemployment insurance, direct cash payments, additional education funding, and a lot more around public health. Then the American Rescue Plan was passed in 2021, $1.9 trillion. This included funds for both education and state and local governments, and I'll go into that in more detail. And then the Infrastructure Investment Act, which was just recently passed in November, which is $1 trillion. Out of that trillion, about $550 billion of that is being focused on real infrastructure. And a lot of the things that were included in the plan originally have fallen out, but some of these things still remain. So really focused on clean water infrastructure, how we can fix our transit infrastructure and the electric grid. So we'll go into that in a little more detail. So the funding that's currently in the market today, public K-12 school districts, local education agencies received $190 billion in flexible funding, and it was all based on a Title I formula. Not all of that has been released, so the latest tranche, and we'll talk more about that, is still available. Public education institutions received $76 billion in direct funding, and a lot of that was focused on tuition relief and based on a Pell Grant formula. And then state and local governments have received $500 billion, so they're getting the most direct funding based on population and unemployment figures. We're going to talk a lot of acronyms today, and it can get really confusing to figure out which programs go with which acts and what all of the acronyms mean. So we'll just kind of start out here. The ESSER funding, which we're going to talk about quite a bit today, there's ESSER 1, ESSER 2, and ESSER 3. That stands for Elementary and Secondary School Emergency Relief Fund, and those funds have been focused on K-12. The Higher Education Emergency Relief Fund for higher education, obviously, and then assistance for state, local, and tribal governments through the Coronavirus Relief Fund and the CSFRF, which is the Coronavirus State Fiscal Relief Fund. So, different acts had different acronyms, so we'll go through all of that here in the next one, but it's been quite a bit for all of us to kind of get our heads around where all these different things are coming from and what's still available. So going back to kind of that timeline of the funding that came out starting in March of 2020 and going through all the way to this latest Infrastructure Act, the CARES Act had the first ESSER Fund, ESSER Fund 1, which was $13.5 billion. It had the government, so the ESSER Fund went to K-12, came through state education agencies, so your Department of Education in the state, and then was released to local education agencies based on applications. The governors also received an emergency relief fund directly. So the governor's emergency education relief fund had $3 billion in it, which could go to either higher education or K-12. And then the higher education emergency relief fund, the first tranche of that came out in the CARES Act. And again, this was focused mostly on tuition relief. And then the Coronavirus Relief Fund also had $150 billion going to state and local governments. The Consolidated Appropriations Act took that kind of further, provided more funding for K-12 through the ESSER 2 fund, and gave some different clarification on what those funds could be used for. So we'll talk a little bit about that. The governors received additional monies, and so did higher education. And then the American Rescue Plan kind of doubled down on that again and put more funding into K-12. I think as we all realized that the pandemic was continuing on and there were still a lot of students that weren't able to get back into the classroom, a lot of the school districts were having trouble making sure that the classrooms were fit for students to occupy them from a ventilation and cleanliness standpoint. So there was quite a bit of impact to the K-12 education industry. And then the Higher Education Fund and the one under American Rescue Plan, which is similar to the CRF that came out in the CARES Act, is the CSFRF. So when you see those acronyms, CRF, CSFRF just reply to different acts, but it's basically the same funding that goes to state and local governments. And then the Infrastructure Act, which we kind of went through, and we'll go into more detail about what is available in that $1 trillion of funding. The duration of the funding. The CARES Act had to be spent by the end of 2021. So most of that money has been spent. I think there were some probably entities that didn't use all of theirs, and some of that might get reallocated to other funds, but the CARES Act funds have really been pretty much expended. The Consolidated Appropriations Act, which again included the ESSER funds and the CRF funds, those funds have until the end of 2023 to be expended. The ARP, American Rescue Plan, is all the way through 2024. And then the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act that just recently got passed extends out into future years. And so there'll be a lot of time to be able to leverage that funding. Talk now about some of these specific funds, just to give you a better idea of the differences between them. So the ESSER funding for K-12, local education agencies can spend up to 80% of the ESSER 3 funds on COVID mitigation work. So they can use those funds, which the ESSER 3 was attached to the American Rescue Plan, or American Rescue Plan. Those funds can be used to develop strategies around public health. They can be used for ventilation in schools. They have to, all of those local education agencies, K-12 school districts, had to develop a return to school plan in order to get the funding. And so, there were some requirements. This was all kind of managed through, at least here in Colorado, through, oh, why is it doing that? Sorry. And it really focused on ventilation being a component of the strategies. And I can share some more of that detail related to what's actually written up in the Act. But in ESSER 2 and ESSER 3, it was clarified that the funding could be used for construction type projects. So if there were modifications that needed to happen to a school's HVAC system in order to increase ventilation or assure that ventilation was adequate, they could use the funding for that. You could use it for control systems and various other things in schools. And then they referred back to the CDC website. So in here, it really talks about kind of those ventilation strategies. The funds could be used to do investigations on existing status of systems within a school to find out if there were closed dampers or other issues that might be causing problems for ventilation down the road. So many different uses in order to get the classrooms back up and running. The relief funds for local governments, again, I mentioned that this came through two different acts. There was the CARES Act and then the American Rescue Plan. The first tranche of funding was the CRF funding, and that went primarily to our largest municipalities. So municipalities that had over 500,000 in population got direct payments from the federal government. Most of this funding was used for relief. Very little of it was actually applied to any type of construction type of projects. It was used for, homelessness and various other things that were associated with just getting people, and shoring up the city budgets and various financial matters like that. The American Rescue Plan actually has now provided money directly to any entity that has a population more than 50,000. So that actually distributed a lot more money to many more entities to be able to provide relief. And then for communities that were less than 50,000, there was the availability to go to the state to get some funding. That funding was available in May of 2021, and then there's more funding that will be coming available in 2022. Regarding indoor air quality and health related funds, and we're going to talk about an example, coming up, we got a couple of examples. You could use the funds for indoor air quality and coronavirus, mitigation in the physical environment in congregate settings. So basically buildings that were open to the public. And then, but again, a lot of this money went to lost revenue, payment for essential workers, investing in broadband and other things. And so I think one of the points of this, seminar is that the money is flowing and there is money that's available. And if you are, working for if you're working for a local government or a K-12 district and you're on the phone and you're thinking this would be nice money to use for a project I have coming up, you've got to go fight for that money. You have to go ask for it from your CFO and kind of get in line, because the money can be used for a lot of different purposes. And same thing in state and local government. So when we think about funding opportunities, and this is a webinar that's being put on by the Colorado Energy Office and the Energy Services Coalition, and our we are focused on energy retrofit type projects in public sector buildings. This funding is available as funding that could be used in addition to lots of other funding sources to allow a city or a school district or a higher education facility to upgrade your systems and get more work done. So that's kind of the purpose of this webinar, is to educate on how you might be able to bring together stimulus monies along with other types of funding that might be out there to actually be able to get more done with those funds. So, there are state and local grants that are available for energy retrofit type of work. Most of the utilities provide incentives and rebates. Some of these energy efficiency type projects or renewable energy projects can be financed. and oftentimes people are using some internal capital funding. You can take all of that and add in money from the CARES Act and from the American Rescue Plan related to, you know, ESSER funds if you're a school district, or the CRF and CSFRF funds for state and local government to actually grow your project and be able to get more bang for your buck. So we did want to just talk about one case study, and this is a project that McKinstry has implemented. This was really a resiliency project focused on the airport in Routt County, which serves the Steamboat Springs area. And they've actually in the past had outages that have taken them down, you know, at really critical periods over the holiday periods when, you know, they have a lot of tourists coming into that part of the state to go skiing. And so resiliency has been a big thing for them. They were able to bring together both some CARES funding as well as some state and local grants from Department of Local Affairs. They received a Renew grant, which was a solar-focused grant. And by bringing in all of that, they were able to implement this project in Routt County at the airport, at the Yampa Valley Airport, and be able to get some solar PV, have backup generation for resiliency, which has been a really great opportunity for them to be able to leverage this funding. So I'm going to switch over to the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, and we pulled this picture. I should know the source. Actually, it came from the New York Times. It's in my little notes here. So this came from the New York Times that published kind of what was originally proposed in the infrastructure package. And you can see, you know, there was a lot that was proposed. It was originally intended to be $2.6 billion and what actually got passed. So the bipartisan plan really passed $550 billion. It's a $1 trillion package, but $550 billion was passed for specifically infrastructure work, kind of noted in these little buckets. So really focused on roads and bridges, railways, airports, public transport, and electric vehicles, you know, figuring out ways to make sure that our public sector fleets are electrified, power infrastructure, so making the grid more resilient, water infrastructure, broadband. That's what the funding will be used for primarily. So what does it look like when we're focusing on things like energy and resiliency? Where can those funds actually be used, and where's the funds coming from, and how can it actually apply to some of the work that many of us are interested in? $47 billion is going to be pushed towards increasing community resilience to climate change and cyber attacks. So if you think about climate change and solar PV and ways to actually, along with battery storage, increase resiliency, there will be funding for that. $15 billion is going to be focused on building out EV charging network and electrifying K-12 school buses. $39 billion on our aging transit infrastructure. So again, replacing diesel buses with electric buses will be part of that. $65 billion on resilience of the grid. So that has the potential to impact some of the work that we do. And then $110 billion, the biggest tranche of that is really going to go for major repair and rebuild of roads and bridges and other major projects with a focus on climate change mitigation. So we're still anxious to understand exactly what that will look like coming down the pike. So with that, my presentation is finished. Ashley, did we want to take questions at the end? Should I pass off to Delynn?
Yeah, let's turn it over to Delynn, and then it doesn't look like we have any other questions in the chat, so we'll plan to answer any remaining questions at the end of Delynn's presentation.
Okay, I need to stop sharing. There we go.
All right. Okay. Sorry, 1 second. Can you guys see my screen?
Yes, looks good.
Okay, great. All right, well, thank you, Leslie and McKinstry team. My name is Delynn Southern. I'm a technical specialist with the Colorado Energy Office. I'm just going to spend the remainder of this webinar discussing the recently passed infrastructure bill and kind of dive in a bit more about the governor's budget proposal. So the Infrastructure Act is over 1,000 pages. It's a light read if you have time. My team actually put some time into pulling out some of those sections that deal more closely with energy and where we see our ESCO poll having a role in helping communities in accessing and applying for funding. So just as a disclaimer, you know, this is a recent hot off the press act. That being the case, there'll probably be more questions than answers at this time. We are hopeful that in the coming months, our office will be able to share more concrete information with you all on program development as well as funding processes. Okay, so like I mentioned, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act passed Congress on December 2nd. It's actually the largest investment in green energy in U.S. history. The full bill text is available online. I think we could probably throw a link into the chat if anyone is interested. Before we get too deep into its content, I want to just let you all know that, you know, because it is federal money, that federal funding does require certain conditions be met. So these are Buy America, which restricts the purchase of non-domestic supplies. Basically, the purpose here is to give preferential treatment to domestically sourced materials and manufactured goods. It'll also consider Davis-Bacon wages. So this creates a standard for paid wages. Here in Colorado, it's also referred to as prevailing wages. Just a note for all of you, for any state projects or state contract work, if the project is valued over $500,000, you automatically have to use the prevailing wage. Next is NEPA. So this is the National Environmental Policy Act. Essentially, it was just created to ensure that federal agencies consider the environmental impacts of their actions when working on projects. And then lastly, we have historic preservation. Another reminder that projects will have to adhere to all local and state historic preservation laws, specifically building sites that are designated as historical. So the main energy pieces within the bill we've got highlighted here. I'll discuss these more in detail during the presentation, but quickly, you know, we have funding for energy efficiency and conservation block grant programs, EV charging and transportation infrastructure, grid resiliency. There are competitive grants for K through 12 schools, as well as energy efficiency revolving loan funds targeted towards commercial and residential buildings. Some other interesting Infrastructure Act components our office will be tracking include funding for wastewater treatment plants, state energy programs. This one's actually pretty important for our office as we work on creating energy programs. There's about $500 million for this. Energy storage is another big one. This will be a big component to our success in reaching just our nationwide renewable energy goals, coupled with, you know, that resiliency piece. Next, there's funding out there for an energy auditors training grant program. We're interested in exploring this funding just to better equip our workforce here in Colorado with managing energy projects. We also found that there's money for district water infrastructure resiliency and sustainability. Just because we're the energy office doesn't mean that we don't see an overlap in water and energy, especially as we, you know, try to better preserve the natural resources that flow through this state. A couple more that we actually don't have on this slide. There's funding for cybersecurity and broadband, hydrogen and hydropower, as well as solar on mine lands, along with some additional funding for energy efficiency in manufacturing and industrial applications. There's also some for building energy codes training. All right, so kind of to get into the meat of this discussion, we have the Energy Efficiency and Conservation Block Program. It's kind of a mouthful, but it's actually an amendment to an existing program, and it will be for $550 million that will include provisions for strategies that can increase energy efficiency and reduce consumption. It encourages behavioral change programs, various measurement and reporting techniques, provides funding for publication of annual reports, helps establish financial incentive programs for energy improvements, and it also provides grants to nonprofits and government agencies to perform energy retrofits. So specifically called out within this bill language is energy performance contracting. So it's something that we do want to closely follow as time moves on. So eligibility and funding. So the state is eligible as well as local governments, Indian tribes, and nonprofits. 68% of those funds will be set aside for grant awards to cities and counties. So the top 10 largest cities in each state are eligible to apply. So that comes out to about $374 million. Next, 28% of those funds will be awarded to states. That comes out to about 1.25% for Colorado, or about $2 million. So our smaller cities in Colorado that aren't eligible for that, that $374 million pot, we'll try to funnel them through this $2 million pool of money. Next, 2% will be set aside for Indian tribes, and then another 2% for other local government efforts that don't meet the population criteria. So these funds will be available starting this fiscal year and until they're expended. So transportation is a big contributor to pollution. So this bill tackles that by providing $57 million that will flow through CDOT. Our office's transportation team will be watching this closely. We expect more information from that team in the coming legislative session. The act does call out grants for charging and fueling infrastructure, as well as emerging intelligent transportation. There's also funding for battery recycling, along with, the research and development, that's included there. There are competitive grants for electric school buses, fleet conversions. So there's actually a lot of transportation pieces included within this bill. So we'll be interested to see kind of how that all rolls out. The funding timeline is listed there on the right. So you'll see we get a pretty good chunk of money each fiscal year to help, implement the programs and help divvy up those grants. Another major piece of the bill, and Leslie touched on this as well, is grid resiliency and reliability. Approximately $50 million is set aside for Colorado to help establish grant programs that will support our electric grid. So this is a formula fund, which means that it will favor areas that are subject to natural disasters. So fortunately and unfortunately for Colorado, we actually may receive more than that $50 million to help with these grants. Listed here are some of the specific items included within the bill. I think some highlights for you guys are the state and local government programs for transmission and storage, energy improvements in rural or remote areas, and then also the support of projects that demonstrate battery storage. And there's additional funding included within all of that to cover cybersecurity. So there's $500 million set aside for public K through 12 schools. These can be accessed through competitive grant applications from your local education agencies. This is to be spent during fiscal year 22 to 26. Grants will cover energy efficiency, renewable energy, as well as alternatively fueled vehicle upgrades. There are some priority applicants. So eligible entities that have renovation, repair, or improvement funding needs, eligible entities that serve a high percentage of students that need free or reduced lunch, and then partnering local education agencies with district local code of 41, 42, or 43, and leverage EPC. All right, and so next we have the Energy Efficiency Revolving Loan Fund. This would establish a revolving loan fund within the state energy program, or those SEP grant funds. It would work with commercial and residential energy efficiency loans and would help fund audits. So 40% of those funds will be distributed to the states. 60% of the funds are allocated to the 15 states with the highest per capita residential and commercial sector energy consumption, or the highest annual per capita energy related carbon emissions. So it's another one that we're going to track in our office and, kind of better understand how we can serve that residential and commercial market in way of, low interest funds. All right, so I quickly want to touch on the governor's budget proposal for this legislative session. So we wanted to close out with just some information from our director, Will Torr. He actually provided this in the form of a blog post. It's available on our website, but for beneficial electrification grants, we actually asked for a total of $25 million to support clean air equity building investment. The energy performance contracting team specifically submitted a request of $12 million to support electrification projects. This funding will be used to help jurisdictions move towards deeper energy reductions and combine, energy efficiency improvements with high efficiency electric heat pumps, and renewable energy to cut energy costs and emissions. 40% of this funding we would want allocated to low income or just transition communities. Next, we have energy codes. So funding is intended to go towards supporting communities in adopting advanced energy codes. So anytime there's new construction, this will make sure that construction, considers that energy piece and hopes, towards helping communities get towards net zero building. So there's $1 million ask for that, or 200,000, depending on the tier that's approved by the governor's office. And so transportation is always a hot topic. The proposed funding we asked for will create a new school bus electrification grant program. This will help Colorado transition its diesel school bus fleet to 100% electric. The proposal creates a grant fund to support school districts' purchase of electric school buses, associated infrastructure, as well as the retirement of their diesel buses. The program will also help districts leverage federal and private financing options. This money would need to be spent over 6 years, but there is an opportunity for our ESCOs and our communities to use the energy performance contracting model to help support these projects. And just quickly, some other items included under that transportation piece. There is $28 million to partner with transit agencies in the Front Range to offer free transit during high ozone season. $15 million for cleaner trucks. So the purpose of this money will be to help get 500 of the dirtiest trucks off the highways and replaced with vehicles that meet current pollution standards. There's another 12 million for electric bicycle rebates and programs. So all the e-bikes that we see around, this would help support us getting 12,000 more of those on our roads. And then lastly, there's a $40 million ask for multimodal streets and transit. So this funding, it builds on the success of the Main Street program that are already in play, and help us provide better access to public transportation, and accommodate the many ways that we, access our public transportation in the state. All right, so we kind of wanted to close out this piece to tie this a bit into energy performance contracting. So those familiar with energy performance contracting understand that energy and operational savings identified through facility assessment or audit are what's used to attract financing and repay the loan. This slide shows how identified savings can be used as grant matches. It further shows how grants and stimulus funding we've discussed today actually help buy down the overall cost of the project. So this structure and this program really offers that low to no cost upfront investment for implementing energy improvement projects. So we'll be anxious to put some of this grant and stimulus money to work, and get more energy performance contracts going here for public jurisdictions in the state. All right, so I think I'll hand it back over to Leslie at McKinstry for, I guess, a little Q&A. Thanks.
Dylan, I believe we did have one question in the chat. If you have any resources for staying up to date with some of these grants, that would be helpful to share. I think, if there's any listserv that people can go to or state website. I did mention the DOLA website for local governments, but do you have any suggestions for staying up to date with some of these evolving grant programs?
I think DOLA is definitely a great one. I know that there is initiative at our office right now with our we have a senior local government policy advisor, and she, with all of this stimulus funding talk, she's going to start sending out a newsletter. So I think that's a good way. I could certainly share the attendee list with her. If people are interested in that way, you can kind of get on her listserv. But I think DOLA is probably a great one right now that's ready to look at.
Perfect, thank you. I think we answered all the other questions in the chat, so we'll open it up to open Q&A. And I know David said, will we be sending out the presentations? Yes, we can PDF these and send them out to everyone that registered, and we'll send out the recording as well. So with that, we'll open it up. If anyone has any other questions, we're happy to answer them now or offline. I can provide the contact information for Dylan and Leslie if they're comfortable with that for follow-up afterwards too.
Sure.
I have a question regarding the building energy codes training that was loosely mentioned. Do you guys have any further information on that? I myself am developing an educational program for architectural solar, and we're training architects and engineers on building energy codes as a nonprofit based in Colorado, and I'm really interested if there's potential funding that's focused on that.
Yep, so I don't have a lot of information on what this recent round of funding will include. If you'd like, if you want to put your email in the chat, I can connect you with our Energy Codes program manager here at the Energy office, because I know that there are some existing resources that you could definitely take advantage of now, and she'll be able to kind of keep you in the loop on any new opportunities that result from not only the governor's budget proposal, but also the federal stimulus program. Thanks, great, I got it.
Perfect, thank you.
And then Dylan, maybe this one's a little bit for you too. Any ideas of timing on the various sources of funding and when that will be available, and suggestions for what public agencies could be doing now to prepare for that funding?
Yep. So a majority of the timelines we've seen within that bill text are fiscal year 22 to the end of 26. Typically that means, like starting in July, we should have like actionable programs that we're ready to put on the street. Unfortunately, it doesn't happen that quickly. I think for other public agencies, communities in Colorado, like attending these webinars, like we'll do our best to, get our ducks in a row, but, we do need a couple of months to really help develop those programs and those processes. So I would say like the earliest we would see stuff really start to happen would be like January of next year to really have programs in place and ready to go.
Perfect, thank you. Do we have any other questions from anyone? Awesome. Well, maybe we can wrap it up. We will follow up with presentations and the recording of this. And thank you all for attending today. Feel free to reach out if you have any other follow-up questions too.
Just a note for everyone on the call. So Christine Berg is our senior local government policy advisor, and she's actually in the chat. So I see that she's been answering quite a bit of questions. So she's a great resource to reach out to as well if you're